The world is divided into four spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, without fear or favor is the New York Times tagline claim to impartiality. However, the paper offers an example of how Western media favor a pro-business bias. I'll speak with economist Ian Hudson about bias in private media. But first, a look at media and Latin America. The Inter-American Press Association has recently labeled Ecuador's national communications law as an attempt to restrict freedom of expression and urged its repeal. But Ecuador's National Assembly voted down the association's proposal. "We must expose the Inter-American Press Association," said congressional leader Raul Patino. "Let's not forget its manipulation by the bankers, who were the owners of the news media here," he said. The president of Ecuador's legislature, Gabriela Rivadeneira, said that freedom of expression has been kidnapped by market forces. "We are not going to endorse the Inter-American Press Association's call for the repeal of our communications law. No multinationals dictate the agenda of our legislative branch of government. There is no way we can allow that such a dangerous precedent be set for the entire continent," she said. Ecuador's national communications law was implemented June 14, 2013. According to Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, the law's purpose was to democratize the media, strengthen freedom of expression, and to promote a good media in the country. Western media traditionally pride themselves as being independent, impartial, and objective. In the case of the New York Times, arguably one of the most important newspapers in the world, it portrays itself as fearless and enlightened. Ian Hudson is professor of economics at the University of Manitoba. He is co-author of The Gatekeeper, 60 Years of Economics According to the New York Times. Hi, Ian, and welcome to Imaginary Lines.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
The New York Times portrays itself as balanced and sophisticated. What kind of bias can private media have?
Any private media, and the Times is not any kind of exception to this, is going to have the bias that you would expect from any privately run corporation that's trying to maximize profits. So if you think about the media industry, they earn their revenue largely through advertising. And so it would be commercial suicide in some ways to run stories and have content that angered advertisers and made people less likely to advertise and therefore generate revenue for your news outlet. And so the Times is no different in this respect. It's a privately owned company. They need to generate profits. And so as a result, their stories are inevitably going to have a bias that's contained by the restrictions that are placed on it through its desire to raise money, basically.
And what is it about the Times that makes it so well positioned to promote a pro-business ideology?
Well, what makes the Times in some ways uniquely positioned is that unlike a lot of media outlets, it has certain characteristics that allow it to both criticize individual businesses, but at the same time maintain stories that reflect the bias of the broader business sector as a whole. And so there are two things about the Times that make it a little different than a lot of other profit-maximizing media outlets. The first one is that the Times has cultivated a very affluent readership. And so readers of the Times are richer than average in the United States. They have fancier houses. They even drink more red wine than most people in the United States. And so this is a very desirable target market for advertisers. So even if the Times were to run a story that ran counter to any one individual specific business, that specific business might still be willing to advertise with the Times because they need access to the Times' very, very lucrative and attractive audience. The second thing about the Times that might make it more able to speak out as a representative of the broader business community is the Times has a slightly different ownership structure than most corporations. So most corporations, especially ones that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange, can be bought and sold at will and have to be constantly on the lookout for takeovers. So if their profits are low and their stock price dives, then they might be taken over. The Times has a slightly different ownership structure. It has two kinds of shares that are available. One that's available to the general public and is not a decision-making or voting share, is one option for everyone. And then the second kind of share that the Times has is a voting share, so it's a decision-making share. And this kind of share is very, very tightly held, really, by one family. And so the Times, if it criticizes businesses and its revenue slumps a little tiny bit and therefore its profits go down, is not going to get taken over the same way other media outlets might have to worry about being taken over. What that means is the Times can be critical of an individual business if the business is harming the overall business interests of the broader sort of corporate sector in the United States. So what you can think about at the Times is that it probably acts as a very, very good and responsible psychiatrist, where it tells individual businesses if they're doing things that are self-destructive and counterproductive. But the only reason it does that is because it has the very best long-term interest of the business community as a whole.
And how does this pro-business orientation translate into reporting internationally on the developing world?
It's interesting because the Times, in this sort of its unique role as being sort of the media outlet for the sort of long-term interests of the business class in the United States, means that in some instances it can take on what appear to be sort of fairly, I guess, liberal policies. Things like, in the United States, policies that favor safety regulations for workers or something like that. But in other instances, it takes a very traditional pro-business line. And in its analysis of foreign economic policy, it has probably been the most obviously, probably the most obviously pro-business segment of the New York Times reporting. And so what it's particularly been insistent on and consistent about reporting is that anything that threatens the profitability of foreign-owned firms or threatens especially ownership of firms in foreign lands has been very harshly criticized by the New York Times.
So, for example, the New York Times recently published an editorial calling for the U.S. to end its embargo on Cuba. How would this understanding of the Times as promoting a pro-business ideology, what would this tell us about an editorial like this?
Sure. So this is actually a really nice example because the embargo on Cuba actually makes no business sense whatsoever. This is the dominance of, I guess, foreign strategic policy or military policy or something like that over economic sense. And so when the Times is thinking about whether or not it makes sense to have an embargo on Cuba, what they're thinking about is whether or not it makes business sense. And clearly it would be much better for U.S. business if it could trade with Cuba, if it could import things from Cuba, if it could export stuff to Cuba. That would be actually an increase in profitability for U.S. business. So this is actually very consistent with what the New York Times has been reporting historically.
One of the sacrosanct institutions of business is private property. And I'm wondering how does the Times report on countries like Venezuela, for example, which are deemed a threat to private property?
Right. So the Times has been very, very critical of Venezuela. And it's basically made three claims about Venezuela that reveal its bias. And so what they argue is first that Chavez using oil money to fund social programs is bad policy. So they argue that oil companies shouldn't be used as social workers. They claim that this is siphoning off the much needed investment surplus from the oil companies and squandering it on social programs. They make claims like Chavez is in fact buying the votes of the poor with this. They also argue more broadly that some of Chavez's other policies, for example, nationalizing cement and steel, are unwise. The government arguing that the government can't run these kind of industries, arguing that the example of nationalizing some industries is going to create massive business exodus out of the country, and broadly defining Chavez's regime as anti-business. The third prong in the Times reporting about these kind of issues is to declare that these policies are unpopular, that they're done by leaders that have no democratic backing. And so part of the Times reporting on Chavez is to paint him as a Castro-like demagogue who's interested in nothing but holding on to power at all costs. And so this is a very particular spinning of what's going on in Venezuela.
Thank you so much, Ian, for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on, Chris.
And now, in other media-related news. Oliver Stone's 2012 documentary, The Untold History of the United States, will soon air on Russia's Channel 1. In a long interview with the Russian public TV channel, the U.S. filmmaker denounced U.S. foreign policy, saying it represents a danger for peace and global security. The three-time Oscar Award winner explained that the United States has set itself up as a state of global security and tries to police the world. This is very dangerous and nobody voted for this, Stone said. Stone commented on the negative effect of U.S. military interventions around the world, the cyber wars involving global spying on entire nations, and the hidden wars fought with money, for example from Wall Street, as a means to control national economies. While criticizing the war on terror, Stone argued that a balance of power between China, Russia, Brazil, Iran, and Turkey would be a preferable situation, including civilized dialogue between the nations. Stone is best known for his iconic films like Wall Street, Platoon, and Born on the 4th of July. He has also directed films critical of U.S.-funded terrorism in Latin America. He said that The Untold History of the United States, created with Peter Kuznick, was the main work of his career and the most powerful. He considers his movies an attempt to improve his country, while at the same time denying that they could be considered an attack on the United States. That's it for today's Imaginary Lines. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.